looking at the book of Exodus, what we are looking at is the beginning of a special people. You know, we read New Testament passages about God's people being special people. Peter talked about us being a peculiar people, which does not mean we're weird, although some of us might be weird. But we're not really weird, we're just different. We're just not the same as everybody else. But what constitutes that non-sameness about which we speak? Well, when you look back in the Old Testament, we've got a kind of a pattern in Exodus. A pattern of how a new people begins. And going with the type and antitype that you see contrasting between the Old Testament, the Mosaic particularly, as well as patriarchal, but mostly the Mosaic, and then the New Testament, and how one represents the other. I mean, you can go into the furniture and the tabernacle itself, the way people were to interact with others. These people were to be special, and they were to be separate and unique. And so when you go to the New Testament and you see the antitype, the real thing of the type, the shadow of things to come, we, God's people, are supposed to be unique. And so one of the parameters you can use to judge, well, what exactly does that mean for us to be unique or different as God's people today? You go back to the Old Testament and look at how things were with the children of Israel, who were God's special people, and you could take the large paradigm, the overarching look of what they were, and then you can apply it to the New Testament people, you and I, and get a kind of a sense of what we're supposed to be. In fact, it clarifies a lot of things when Paul says in 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, you know, we should not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Well, what exactly does he mean? Well, you go back to the Old Testament and you look at the major problem the children of Israel had when they came from the wanderings in the wilderness and came into Canaan to take over Canaan, and they were supposed to run everybody out. Well, was that just a cruelty? Was that one of those pogroms that, you know, Russia did to get rid of certain people? No, that was an order God gave these people so they could be unique and special and different. You weren't supposed to intermarry. You weren't supposed to do business. You weren't with them. You weren't supposed to make covenants with them. And of course, right out of the box, Joshua makes a covenant with the Gibeonites. So you can see humans trying but failing sometimes to grasp what God has in mind when he says, be ye separate. You know, we're supposed to be different. Well, when you look back at even the very beginnings of a special people, that's what we find in Exodus 5. Because frankly, the promise came through Abraham way back in Genesis. We mentioned that this morning in Genesis 23 and 22. And so there's the beginnings of it. But really the beginning of special people occurs here when God tells Moses, and I'm not going through, there's tons of history I'd like to go through. We don't have time. But God calls Moses out for a special task. Okay? He is the most educated of his peers around because he was raised up in all the knowledge and wisdom of Egypt. Okay? He was the most qualified in that he was the meekest man on the planet at the time. And I would say until Christ himself. And so we got a man who is very unique and very qualified, had spent 40 years in Egypt learning and adapting, and then 40 years in the wilderness, and then 40 years leading. And so Moses is a unique kind of critter. He's just different than everyone else. And so when he's called to go in, God tells Moses, I'm going to let, because of course Moses excuses before the burning bush, oh, I can't say all the right words. And God tells him, well, who made your mouth? In other words, God could get you through this. And so God gave Moses Aaron to be his spokesman. And he tells Moses, when you get in there and start talking to this Pharaoh, I'm going to make you like a god to him. Now you have to understand the concept of God, because God understood and understands what gods, plural, are, as humans make gods. And when you look at Egypt, all the plagues, the 10 plagues, were a slap in the face of all of the Egyptian gods. That's a study for another time. But nevertheless, when it came to the end of things, Pharaoh was ready to let him go because everything he understood as God just didn't exist anymore after the plagues. But before that, as this special people began, notice what he says when Moses says, let my people go. His question is, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? He did not know who God was. And this was not something in effect saying, I'm rebellious against God per se. He just did not know any concept of a God that is an overarching, everything under his auspices. And so when you start talking about the beginnings of a people, the first thing that has to happen is an understanding of who God is. We live in a culture where one day, at one point in many of your lives, you talk to your friends who were very religious. Blue laws were still in effect. People were expected on the first day of the week to go to church, as the phrase goes, somewhere. And so you are working from a foundation that used to be pretty consistent in this country. That's not the case anymore. There are parts of Michigan right now that are wholly under Sharia law because there are so many Islamic folk living there. That's the place that we have come to in our culture. We have people, and I think Austin is a great example of it, an entire city there where there is barely anyone down there who even has a concept of God because they were not raised that way, their parents were not raised that way, and their grandparents barely remember who God is. We live in a time now where we need to start at a foundation with people if we're going to be a new people, a different people, and have people understand who we are. And that is that God exists. He is all-powerful. He is over all. I've already in fact, I just got approved from the elders to do our lecture this coming spring on Genesis, the first chapter, because there are so many people in our culture these days who have been fed garbage throughout high school, junior high and high school, and into college that tells us that there is no such thing as God. We're nothing but glorified cockroaches, and we just evolved up to where we are. And now the tide is turning and is shifting a little bit, and there's more and more information out there from technology, archaeological finds, and this kind of thing that tells people, oh no, there is a God. In fact, it doesn't even make logical sense not to believe in God. This new people had to be established on that premise. And our assumption would be that the children of Israel, oh, they knew their God. No, they didn't. This is a people who had been a slave people in Egypt, and they knew the gods of Egypt. But it had been years and years, 430-some years that they had been in Egypt and away from the God-fearing of Joseph and the God-fearing Jacob and some of those patriarchal heroes they had in way back times of the 12 tribes of Israel. Oh, certainly they knew something about God, but to know who he really was even strange to them. They had to learn who God is. As a matter of fact, as you read through the plagues, you will find the children of Israel sometimes just as shocked and surprised as anyone else that was in the land of Egypt at some of the things that were going on. It was shattering to them that these events were occurring. But God is all-powerful. And to begin a people, they have to know who God is. Second point, you can go a little further down, and Pharaoh makes a comment in verse 5. He said, look, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their labor. I want to sum this up as a finger pointing that would make Eve proud. Because this is blaming somebody else for what's going on here. God is telling Pharaoh through Moses, you need to let my people go. It's time for it. It's been predicted. It's going to happen. And you need to let them go. And Pharaoh doesn't know who God is, and he's about to find out. But in establishing a new people, we need to have a concept or a notion of the fact that when you change your life and who you are to become that new person of God, not everybody's going to understand it. Matter of fact, they're very likely to blame you as a problem in your change. I always thought it's interesting in Romans, the 6th chapter, which we have used on many occasions, to highlight the idea of how we become Christians. We're baptized into Christ. We rise up and walk in newness of life. But the plea in Romans 6 is to leave the sin behind of which we were once a part. And down, you have to look it up and fact check me, around verse 22. There are some comments there where Paul, almost incredulous at the Roman conduct, is saying, why are you practicing these things of which you were once ashamed? Why are you going back to stuff that you had left because you became a new people? And what happens very often is, because of peer pressure, because of people around us, we have this social nature about us that presses us to conform and to compromise. Oh, it's so easy to get along better if we'll just compromise a little and not go so far as to stand on a principle and say this is the way it is. Because what's going to happen when we do? We're going to get blamed for being the problem. I think it's quite interesting reading through historical accounts of the churches of Christ in 1900, the turn of the century, 1900, as people began to divide in churches of Christ over the instrument and whether or not it was authorized or not in the worship. And it's phenomenal to me that most of the guys who were pressing and pushing for the instrument in the church, which is not authorized, were the ones who would accuse the others of creating division. And I get tickled about that. But why are you accusing me of creating division when you're the one bringing in the instrument of music? That's not right. I'm not causing division. I'm staying with the Bible. You're the one that's departed from the Bible, and by your departure, you are the one that is the problem. And yet, the ones who stay with the Bible, they're the ones that are divisive. They're the ones that are hard-hearted. Pharisaic, I always like that one. Not realizing, of course, those who accuse people of being Pharisaic are the very ones who want to go with traditions of men and authorize those in their worship and in their life. No, the real Pharisees are the ones that are innovating and changing the word. Here in this particular passage, Pharaoh had nobody to blame but them. It couldn't possibly be my fault that I'm not, catering to God, the real God of the universe. And again, we have to cut him a little slack because I don't believe he even understood or knew who really Jehovah God was. And when he found out, he was more than happy for them to leave. In doing this kind of thing, when you start drawing lines and saying, okay, somebody's to blame for you guys being different than everybody else, there are three things that are mentioned from verse 7 to verse 9 that I find very interesting. Because you see, if you can't by reason and you can't by faith place the blame on somebody for being different, then what you do is you make their life miserable. And that's exactly what Pharaoh chose to do with these people. You'll no longer give people straw to make the brick. Let them go and gather the straw themselves. You just increase their labor load by not providing them the materials they needed to do the slave work they were doing. Then secondly, you're going to have the quota of bricks you had before because you're idle by crying out you need to worship your God. There's an irony in and of itself when they worship not just one God, but all kinds of gods, and took time to do so. But you wanting to worship God, oh, you're at fault here. And third, more work's been laid upon them, but you're not. You need to work more, and you need to heed the pressure of this persecution so that you don't buy into these, quote-unquote, the last words of verse 9, false words. Yeah, that's the fallback of anyone who does not want to believe what God says. They must be false words. Now, of course, that assumes that people aren't smart enough to know what is false and what is not false, which when we are going to be the new people, a unique people, we need to have a good command of what it is that makes us that new people. The Israelites struggled, and they have if there was a long learning curve, if nothing else, God gives us a great example of how his patience stuck with these people, even though on occasion he told Moses, okay, I'm done with this bunch, we're going to kill them all and start fresh. And Moses pled for their souls, and God relented and said, okay, I'll give another shot. Okay? But to me, the story of the Exodus is one of the greatest stories of God's patience with people who have a long learning curve. They had to know who God was. They had to realize that they couldn't be pleasing to God unless they followed him in every regard, which they didn't very often. But the words of God are true, and frankly, it was the words of God that made the children of Israel unique and special and different. You know, we go through Deuteronomy and Leviticus very often, and it's so tedious, some have said, because there's so many directives and so many laws and so many things. But you know what? When you look at those two books and all of the things that were required of them by Mosaic law, that was all what made them unique. That's what made them special. Nobody else wandered around carrying a tent full of a bunch of furniture that was holy when you set it up. Nobody else went in a big group and then set up in certain places around the camp. Some on the east, some on the west, some on the north, some on the south. That was unique. All of these directives were what made them unique. And so when Jesus says, sanctify them by thy word, by thy truth, thy word is truth, that which makes us unique is when we stick to the word. That's what makes us a special people. This special people is not a real good example of being special. Okay? I mean, they no sooner got in the land, they were mixing married, they were making covenants with the people of the land. They were having problems. They caved into the idols of the land, and all through the kings that were mentioned in this morning's lesson. All through those kings, all the way to the top of the scale. They were sinful, and they were, you know, you can go to Israel and you look at guys like Ahab, marrying Jezebel. Oh, what a rotten couple that was. And here are people who should have been special people. They give us a great example of how patient God is until you get to Malachi when he said, okay, I'm done now. For 400 plus years, you're not going to hear from me because I'm done now. I have been patient. I have hung with you. I have done everything possible to show you what it is to be a loving father to a child who just rebels and will not listen, because you're supposed to be special. Now, what's frankly interesting to me is when you go over to Acts 2, if you want to parallel in type antitype, and look at Acts 2, and all of a sudden, as Peter gets up and preaches, and he uses all of these Old Testament scholars and all of these Old Testament prophecies, and he begins to explain the new system. Do you notice the simplicity in comparison? There is no tabernacle anymore and furniture in the tabernacle. As a matter of fact, incense that was used in the tabernacle to cover the smell of a whole bunch of dead animals, these days are prayers. The simplicity of the instructions in following God are there in Acts. When men and brethren, what shall we do? Peter said, oh, you're okay where you are. You don't have to do anything. No, not really. But he did give them direction. But what direction did he give them? Was it a long, complex series of things they had to go through with feast days and certain things you bring to sacrifice, and you've got to dress a certain way when you go to your service in the temple? And no, none of that. Repent and be baptized, and then later on in John, live faithful unto death. There is such simplicity in what God asks of us as his special people. And here's what's scary about it. Because we'll all be judged by the things that we do, according to 2 Corinthians 5:10, okay? You look at the Old Testament people and what were they required to do that made them special. Whew. You have 3 books there, you know, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Leviticus. I did it backwards. Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Look at all the stuff that they had to do. Look how complex their commands were, and what right down to daily things of how you washed your hands and what utensils you used. What does God require of you and me? Just so very little. Of course, too, that has the other side of the coin. When those Jews get up there, having lived faithfully and followed God to the T, doing the best they could to follow every detail of what God said to do, and those of this era go stand before God, what kind of answer will one give when they're not willing to do so simple the things of which God requires us this day and age? Yeah, the judgment's going to be rough for folks when they discover I wasn't that special people. And the shadow of the things to come and all the details that people were to keep there were given as an illustration of how we are unique and different. And here today, I'm not unique. As a matter of fact, if I walked down the street, you couldn't tell me any difference from any other religion in America, to our shame. No, we need to be very different. We need to be very unique. And following an example of how new people begins, here in Acts 2, here's how the new people began. Those who gladly received his word were baptized, and the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. Folks, it scares me sometimes how simple God's commands are to us and how we fail. And how we take for granted the blessing that God has given us of not being under a Mosaic law or such technical, difficult things were required if you wanted to be faithful. Oh, we got it easy. But don't think for an instant standing in judgment is going to be any easier. You know, in Hebrews 10, And it's just talking about the simplicity of attending a worship assembly. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, because y'all are here, okay? But frankly, the context is being faithful by showing your faithfulness in attendance to the worship assemblies. And the example given in verse 26, you know, in the old times, when somebody, at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, somebody went wrong, oh, it was a terrible thing. In verse 31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. I think that is a warning de jour. It's a top end of letting us know, y'all don't have it hard. We don't have it hard. We really don't. What's our excuse going to be when we have not served God like we should have? Because we're His special people. We're unique. We're different. We just need to be more and more that way as we live through this life. I would encourage you, if you're not special and unique like you should be, then make a change in your life and respond to the invitation as read in this song.